மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Having looked at all of the critical options white has in the classical variation, including the endgame lines and the lines with opposite side castling, now going to deal with all of the other deviations that white may try against the Capablanca variation. Now, white has an abundance of options here, but in my experience, these lines are played very, very rarely. So, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to give a proportional sort of look at these variations, giving them, of course, the most attention to the lines that I've seen in my games and in my students' games being played the most. So this is going to be our starting position after bishop f5, and I'm going to actually mention immediately here, we've only looked at the move knight g3. The only move that we can be that's worth knowing is the move knight to c5. I once faced the move knight g5 against actually a master player, but I simply played e6, castle developed normally, well, basically can't really do much about moves like knight g5. Your opponents are going to play some wacky, strange moves from time to time, and you just need to follow the chess rules. Same goes for a move like knight c3. But knight c5 is actually a little bit of an interesting option. It's been played by some strong players. The knight targets b7. Now, there's actually a decent amount of theory in this variation, but as I said, it's quite rare and not very critical, so I'm going to sort of just give you two quick options against it. Now, if you just want an easy life, if you don't want to get involved in anything, you can just play the simple b6, then white plays knight b3, and now e6. And black's idea here is we're just going to develop our pieces quite normally. White's idea here is that, well, he's just going for a normal playable game. He can argue that we've weakened the queen side a little bit, so generally white will play g3, bishop g2. The game here is quite normal. Normal piece development. Black should probably play for c5 down the line. This is a very simple solution. A more aggressive option here is to play the move e5. Now, of course, the pawn is immune because the knight is hanging on c5. So here, white should really take up the gauntlet, play knight takes b7. Otherwise, he's just going to be hopping around with his knight, not really sure what he's going to be doing with that. So knight b7, queen b6, knight c5. And now there's two options, but the one that I was going to recommend here is, again, keeping it simple, bishop takes c5. There's also this nice option of c takes d4, but this does have a bit of theory attached here, and the positions can get a bit sharp, but this is a perfectly good line to play if you want to have a look at it in your own time. That would be perfectly fine, but again, this variation is so rare, you can just play simply, take the knight, pawn takes, queen takes, and white does have the two bishops and black has some fractured pawns, but black has a lead in development here. Pawn on c2 is already hanging, so white usually plays c3, then knight f6. Again, black's pieces just flow to good squares. This pawn in the center is quite strong. And the position should be around equal white. It's a bit unbalanced here. That's why you have the two options. You have b6, easy life, and you have e5 going for a bit of a more aggressive game. Of course, here black has a lead in development, central control, easy squares for his piece to go to. So very viable option here. So that deals with knight c5 here, which is actually not such a bad move, but again, not very critical. So we're going to look at after knight g3, bishop g6. The option that I would like to give the most attention, really, the one that I faced the most in my games, is actually a very, very sort of calm idea from white. He plays knight f3, so he's going for knight e5 potentially. We play knight d7, and now the move bishop d3. So very, very similar to what we already looked at, but without the move h4. White, in this variation, he's just going to develop his pieces, try to control the center, try to gain some extra space or maintain his current space, and just a nice, calm way to play. Now, the reason that I suspect this variation has been quite popular in practice, at least in my practice, is because white may be just looking forward to a simple game. Maybe he wants to draw, he's playing a high-rated player, he doesn't really want complications. Or maybe this is just white's style. I must actually admit that I've actually recommended some of my students to play this line with white, and I've actually seen them have very good results with it, even against high-rated players, because a lot of times what players do here, they get really annoyed with this variation, and they're like, oh, this is so silly, this is such a harmless line. Maybe they get a little careless, they can allow themselves to play a little bit recklessly, and white really hasn't done anything wrong here. So what I'm going to do here, personally, when I face this variation, I'm realistic. I understand that it's very, very solid for white. But on the other hand, it's also very, very solid for black. Again, no bad pieces. E6, knight f6, bishop e7. Very easy for our pieces to come out and get good squares. Of course, there's not a lot of conflict going on in the position right now. But the conflict will be will be there. We just need to get our pieces out, look for our chances, and the fight will come. So first thing I'd like to do is show one of perhaps my best games in this line, and a very good idea of how you can generate some positive play here. In this game I played the simple knight g to f6. Nowadays I actually prefer playing e6 because I'm going to play both of these moves most likely, but e6 I'm 100,000,000% going to play. The knight on g8 actually may sometimes go to e7, very rarely, but it's just a small wrinkle. But knight f6 was played in this game, castles e6, and now my opponent plays b3. So I'm going to look at a second game after this one, but this is one of the setups White can choose here, playing b3, fianchetting the bishop, playing c4, very common line. We'll also look at other possibilities, for example, this bishop just coming out and getting developed. So b3 was played in this game. Now I just played bishop e7, bishop to b2, and I decided to castle. Nowadays, I actually, if you notice, we have this tension going on between these bishops. The reason that I don't take on d3 is because I actually want White to take on g6, for example, let's say here, because this would give me the open h-file and will allow me to toy with some ideas of castling long, because now this attack can actually have some potential with the h-file. When I'm castling short, nowadays I usually trade on d3 because I don't like giving myself double pawns on the g file for no reason. But in this particular game, which I played in 2012, so 5 years ago, I still did not work out these tiny little details. So bishop takes g6, h takes g6, and again, quiet position. Both sides are very solid. White has a little bit more space. So let's see how the game goes from here. c4 was played by my opponent. Okay, typical setup. And now I play the move a5. Now, this is a very typical idea. It's known sort of a piece of advice that if you want to sort of unbalance the position without really doing too much, it's always a good idea to push your rook pawns because they don't generally influence the game negatively. For example, we play luffs all the time, like h6, a6, giving our king breathing room. But at the same time, you can sort of push them down the board, activate potentially the latent power of the rook, and just probe at your opponent's position. And this works really well against this fianchetto structure. Pawn may go to a4, put a little pressure on my opponent. Maybe in some lines I'll even go to a3, get some cramping effect. But just a nice way to gain some space and start to sort of think about generating some imbalances and some chances. Opponent goes queen c2. Now I play queen to b6. So linking up the rooks, preparing to bring them to open file, also putting some pressure on the center. Nice calm play. Rook fd1 follows rook fd8, and now my opponent plays a3. So I'm not actually a big fan of this move. It doesn't look like a bad move at all. He's just perhaps maybe taking a b4, maybe taking control of the b4 square so that my bishop can't go there. Maybe he's planning a4 b4. But still, this does loosen up White's position a little bit, and it doesn't look like that matters now, but let's see what happened in the game. Rook a to c8, as was advertised. Knight goes to e2, so that's a pretty decent move. Maybe the knight's going to c3. White is just maneuvering around. Now I play queen a6. So this is actually one of the ideas I want to stress here. This is a very nice idea, in my opinion, in order to get some counterplay. Of course, all our pieces are nice, out-developed. Basically, it's hard to ask for our pieces to be doing any more than they currently are. So now it's time to come up with a plan. And the move queen a6 does just that. Remember how I said these pawns are sort of White has weakened the structure a little bit? Well, the purpose of queen a6 is I'm actually trying to play b5. And this is an idea we're very, very familiar with at this point, trying to fight for the light squares. And in this position, even though White's king is not on the queen side, but castle king side, this idea can still work quite well because of the structure. I just want to get some light squares. Knight f4, b5. Going through with the plan, White goes knight g5. So White is really menacing some potential sacrifices here. Got me worried for a little bit, so I played knight f8. Nice, calm. Now there's no sacrifices, and we can start following through with our plan. Rook c1, a4. Of course, if I take here, takes here, this doesn't fulfill the plan of winning over some light squares. But after a4, now I'm threatening a double undermining procedure here, which will give White two isolated pawns on d4 as well as a3, and give me the d5 outpost. Again, is Black better here? I don't think so. But I would definitely take Black's position here, and I'm also perfectly happy playing Black here. There's action in the position going on. We're creating some chances. This is no longer a bone-dry game. White retreats with knight f3 after his failed sort of excursion. Pawn b3, queen b3, and I could take on c4 right away, but I decided to play rook b8 in preparation for the open file here. Also, of course, setting up the threat against the bishop on b2. And now white plays c5. So very, very familiar situation for us, this pawn structure. But here, there's a couple more points. This bishop on b2 is quite poor. Pawn on a3 is weak. d5 outpost is ours. Now I can sort of start pressing and gathering all my pieces together and trying to put pressure on this backwards pawn and just slowly improving my position while tying white down to his weak points. So knight d4, hitting at this, placing that in this outpost. Knight takes, rook takes, so getting ready to double up. Quite pleasant stuff here. Knight e5, and now I play knight h7. So looks, where am I going? Well, now knights are quite funny pieces, so I'm actually going to the center by going to the side first. The reason that I don't want to play knight d7 is worried about knight d3, where my rook can actually get close to being trapped in the fortress threat. So the purpose of knight h7, after knight d3, I can just go queen to b7, not worried about knight b4 because of rook d7, which is actually what happened in the game. Rook c2, knight to f6, as advertised, rook e2. White really doesn't have anything constructive to do. He has to sit back, wait for me to mobilize, or at least it's quite difficult to find a good suggestion here. Knight d5, bishop c1, rook d8. This is actually a pretty decent plan for white. The bishop was obviously doing nothing on b2, so he gets it around to potentially better days, but actually next move he just goes back to b2. It's really hard to activate this bishop, really. For example, takes, you can put on e3, well actually not even here because of bishop c5, but even if the bishop could calmly go to e3, still it's nothing more than a big pawn playing just a bunch of defense. So back to b2, just maybe showing how tough it is to handle this position with white. Don't really have any plans. Let's look at the finish here, because at this point, takes, bishop f6, the pressure is to a boiling point. White is completely tied down to this weakness, no active play. Rook d2, rook d5. Now I'm preparing to swing the queen into the battle. My opponent plays g3, a mistake, quite an instructive one. More pawns going on the dark squares are only going to make this bishop less happy, and this actually also weakened some light squares. So immediately I play g5, threatening to go g4, get some lockdown going. h3, queen d7, eyeing maybe some e5 possibilities, and of course also eyeballing the pawn on d4. So f4 was played to stop e5, quite drastic measures. Takes, king is wide open. g6, king h2, king g7. Now I'm just preparing to swing all my pieces to the h file. Of course, my pieces easily find good outposts, can swing from side to side. Meanwhile, his pieces are all just completely tied down to this weak pawn. Queen g3, rook to h8. Now he goes king to g2, rook h5, rook h1, and a simple tactic to finish the game. Queen h5, queen d5 rather, king g1, takes. I'm winning back my material here with of course a pawn advantage. Rook d8, all the advantages in position still exist. Up pawn, up positionally, game over. I will only finish this game because there's one more tactic played, worthwhile maybe to look at. Rook a3, rook d3. White is just completely tied down. King f8, king to g2. Now rook b3, king f2, rook takes c3. Fitting end, takes, game over. So and the fitting end, I say fitting end because the final blow comes on the d4 square. So I believe this is a very nice game, even if we don't look at the moves at all, just the concept of how to handle these positions. We start off with this boring, maybe, of course, very unassuming position for both sides. But again, white has done nothing wrong. He has simply developed. He's controlling the center. And there's also, all the pieces are still on the board. There's only been one pawn traded. So to think about drawing and boring, it's kind of a stretch. Got to be realistic, though. Of course, there's no immediate conflict. Doesn't mean there won't be conflict in the future. And again, this plan of a5 here is quite effective. And of course, the star idea, to fast forward a bit, queen a6 and then b5, fighting for these light squares. And the ultimate culmination, of course, came with this. Of course, all of these positions are quite beautiful, but maybe my favorite one is this one where every single piece, let's get rid of these arrows here, all of black's pieces are wonderful, pressuring against d4, all of white's pieces are passive, and you just sort of collapse here. So this is actually a pretty good formula to beat players who are just desperate to make a draw against you here. They're going to play maybe
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. தேங்க்யூ.